All right, and we're back. It's Teacher Talk with Paul and Jay. Jay, good to see you again. Feels like it's been a while.
Good to see you, Paul.
Yeah. So happy to meet back up and get back into the next book of the Odyssey. If you're just joining in with us, this is Teacher Talk. Jay and I teach, and we are working our way book by book through the Odyssey. We want to offer a little bit of why teach the Odyssey. We want to offer a little bit of how from our years of doing it, teaching it with high school students of various degrees of academic ability, of various ages. But really what I think we really want most of all is just to inspire you to do it, to inspire you to teach. Jay, I was at a presentation. My son's looking at colleges. I was at a presentation last week, and the provost of the school started talking, kind of emphasizing that the school was really a teaching college. And he made a little aside to everyone in the room. And he said, if you've been taught, if you've been taken through a great book of any kind, you should teach it. You should be out there. You should be out there teaching. And I thought of you. I thought about what we're doing here, and about what the podcast is about. And that's it. We've been taken through it. We've gone through it, and now we're pushing that out. And so, if you're listening and you need a little bit more motivation, a little bit of push to get into a circle of people in your life and teach something that you've been taught, especially the Odyssey, I hope we can give you that extra nudge or inspiration to do it, or even maybe just some anger because you want to do it right because we're messing it up and you want to get out there and fix it. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But to get more students through it is a great goal of ours. So
and I think too that to be transparent and honest, and you and I would say to anybody listening, these are our own sort of subjective opinions, reactions to a very complicated, nuanced story that scholars spend their entire lives thinking about and don't finish thinking about. So one of the great things about teaching books like this is that you have to sort of come to grips with the fact that it's beyond you to completely understand, not unlike any human being, is we never totally understand other human beings, which I think makes life interesting, and it also makes books interesting. So I think you can either choose to get like frustrated by that or embrace it and say, oh, this is a really interesting book to visit and revisit. And here are Paul and Jay, and they're saying what they think, and maybe that's going to lead me to think my own thoughts. So I think that's this is one of those books, and you and I have said this about other books too. We could teach this every year for 50 years and it's never boring.
Yeah. And reread it. I reread it every time I teach it. I read it cover to cover again, and I'm eager to do it. And that's not true for all the books I sometimes find myself compelled to teach, or even that I think I ought to. But it's a great comparison, Jay. It's a comparison to your life. You can find the many-sidedness of life, something that just kind of shuts you down. You don't take on your own life or take on your life seriously because it's so much. Or you can dive into it and dig into each details and sort of proudly walk through every little part. So same with the Odyssey. It's very much like that, and that's sort of a picture. Also, I know I have in mind that I want to give, or an experience. I want my students to have of the Odyssey, to experience that, to feel that, and to feel that connection to a book they have no business connecting to by some perspectives. It's so distant from them in just about every imaginable way. But what a pleasant surprise to find out how essentially it's just not,
Right.
So anyway, but before we jump in, Jay, we need a poem. I'd love to start off this episode. So as usual, what do you have for us?
So I just want to share a former colleague of Paul and mine. This guy, Bill, he was a Vietnam veteran who taught a class on American foreign policy from World War II to today. And it was called War and Peace. And a collection of poems that Bill would share was by a poet named Doug Anderson. And the name of the book is called The Moon Reflected Fire. Doug Anderson was a medic in the Vietnam War and saw a lot. And a lot of this poem, a whole chunk of this poem, sort of is a Vietnam veteran's imagining of the Trojan War. So because a key moment in book 8 is a sort of a poet recalling key moments from the Trojan War, I thought Doug Anderson's poem, A Bar in Argos, would be interesting. This does have some language, so, but it's not a polite subject. So
Right. We're
the
talking about
language,
killing. We're talking about killing here.
yeah, the subject matter should bother you more than a swear should bother you.
Yeah.
So this is A Bar in Argos by Doug Anderson.
Hmm.
They'll tell you it was a wooden horse. I'll tell you it was not. We gutted 20 oxen and slid inside their empty bellies, but for our short swords, naked. Then were sewn up, delivered to the city gates as an offering of peace, acquiescent to Troy's enduring power. And that night, while the cooks made the fires to roast the beasts with us as stuffing, we cut the rawhide sutures and were born out of the stink and slime, killing first the cooks, head first in their vats, their legs kicking, then moving through the streets, garroting sentries, dousing their torches in puddles, killing blindly, twice killing our own, catching Trojans in their beds, and Odysseus, ecstatic, almost forgetting to open the city gates, the high point of his night when, with a pike, he pinned a woman to her bed right through her lover's back. I tell you, I was sick, still am. It rots your soul. It's just that anything you think is twisted, Odysseus can give another twist you wouldn't think was there to give. I tell you, the man's a son of a bitch. Wooden horse? Fuck me. We were shat out of oxen to win that war.
Mm. A Bar in Argos.
A bar. So Doug Anderson's collection is great. So the Moon Reflected Fire, it is great. It's a really good companion with The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, which is probably the closest thing to a modern Iliad we have, I would say.
Yes, and taught a lot of kids have read that.
Oh my God,
that's intense. That's an intense poem, Jay. I haven't read that or heard that before. And I like that. They'll tell you, the opening line, they'll tell you it was a wooden horse. And that reminds you of every war you've ever sat down and talked about with someone. There's always this is what we thought, this is what we were told going in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, from every level, from just viewer at home watching TV to the soldier on the field. And I like that the twist. There's no level that Odysseus can't put another twist on.
Yeah,
that'll blow your mind. And there's that pernicious side of him too, that's just nasty. He almost forgets to open the gates. He's ecstatic.
Yeah,
I believe that. I believe those lines. I believe those are all true lines.
Yeah,
from that poem, from my reading of Odysseus and overall admiration of Odysseus. I'm not ashamed to say. But that's in there. Okay, I like that. From the collection, The Moon Reflected Fire by Doug Anderson, A Bar in Argos, worth digging into.
Yeah.
Okay, we've been walking along through book by book the Odyssey. We've made our way up to book 8. In the translation I'm working through, the Robert Fitzgerald translation I'm working from, this chapter is called Songs of the Harper. Jay, are you doing Emily Wilson's translation again?
Yeah. Hers is called The Songs of a Poet, so basically the same thing.
Songs of a Poet. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Very much the same thing. So let's do our lineup. Let's go through it. I'd like to break this down in terms of the essentials of the book. What are sort of the basics of the book? Maybe the essentials. And then let's hit the big obvious point that you really need to grasp or land on. Then maybe a surprising point that we find in the book, and a lingering question. And sometimes a surprising point and the lingering question are very, very similar. But that thing, I like that thing in the end that you and I still have questions about, because as we've talked about before, I'm really evolving on this. I'm walking this tightrope between, as you said in the opening, Jay, reading this by my own headlights, just by my own lights, and walking through this, bringing in some scholarly stuff here and there, but not being overwhelmed by that. I want this to be a really personal interaction with this book, and I'm sort of growing and learning. And so sometimes when I run into a question, the last thing I want to do is run to a fantastic source like Emily Wilson, who could tell me everything about every word, in the passage in question. But instead to sort of sit with that and try to work that out, along with, page by page with the book. So it's nice to find these lingering questions, these things we're still sitting with, and working through, using to kind of ply our way through the deeper levels of the text. So we'll get those, but let's start with the essentials. What's the essentials of the chapter, Jay? Where would you start with that?
I would say that the book, it's important to be mindful that he's in the court of the Phaeacians. It's idyllic and wonderful and peaceful, and they don't know war, and he's a war-hardened man. So it's almost like going to Mars. It must be just so foreign to everything he knows. And this poet, they still don't know who he is. So they've exhibited xenia or hospitality because they're being kind to him, not asking for his identity overtly yet, which is a key ingredient of hospitality. So they don't ask for the ID right away. That's not hospitality. You treat people well because they might be a god. That's why you treat them well. So anyway, that's interesting. This poet centers on a poet named Democritus. Is that his name?
Demodocus is what I've always said, but I don't know.
So he sings 3 songs, and quickly, the first song is an argument Odysseus and Achilles had during the Trojan War, which puts on the map the idea that someone named Odysseus was important. This is before they know that Odysseus is there. And then we have this weird, and you might be talking about this more, but this weird story of the gods and Hephaestus, the great smith, who, among other things, builds Achilles' shield and all of that, and Aphrodite, that's a weird couple. Hephaestus is like a cripple guy, and Aphrodite is really beautiful. It's not the stereotypical couple, and maybe that's why Aphrodite ends up having an affair with the god of war. So there's this weird, we have an argument story, we have a god adultery story, and then Odysseus asks, so this is like the Spotify playlist chapter of the Odyssey, where you get like several different songs, right, for the occasion. Right. And Odysseus requests a song about the Trojan horse, which I always say to my students is like Tom Brady saying, tell me about Super Bowl from 2002 again, because he won that. It was great. So, but it's just not what you'd expect. And I'm going to go into detail about why I think that's interesting. But this chapter is largely about a playlist of songs that are all totally different and a bit weird. But we're sort of conditioning the reader and the court of the Phaeacians to get ready to hear from Odysseus, the man, as Odysseus. And I think these songs serve that purpose.
Okay. And the setup, why is Demodocus singing songs at all? This is just their expression of hospitality, right? They're hosting this stranger who's washed up on shore, who we've had this drama with in the previous chapter, with Nausicaa, the king's daughter, and all of that, which we went into detail in the previous episode. And this is just dinner at the king's house, right?
I think in the context of the poem, it's a good question. In the context of the poem, yes. I think the reader brain has to be mindful that the way you live forever is the glory, the kleos you need to live forever is through poets.
Yes.
So it's also sort of underneath the hood of this chapter, these little subtle or not subtle reminders that if Odysseus is going to live forever, it's in the mouth of guys like this. And I think that's pretty interesting.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. There's several points here that you can land on with students. I mean, talking about, as we've done a lot, the xenia, the hospitality thing. There's so much in that. And I think, when you said this, you don't ask who the person is. There's all kinds of elements of rudeness, potentially associated with that. But the other side is you might be talking to a god, and there's something in the Christian era that's a parallel. You treat other people
absolutely
with humanity because there is something of a god in them, right? They are made in the image of God, and they are little.
And what you do to the least of these, you do to me. It's right.
Yes.
It's
yes. And so there's a thread of continuity there. And we're not asking your name or where you're from or why you're here or how you got to be in this situation where you need me to give you a meal tonight or whatever. None of that's relevant. None of that's relevant. You might be a god. You have something divine in you. And that gives us sort of this brotherhood thing. So there's lots of lines like that you can make with, especially we teach this to ninth graders a lot. And that's inspiring stuff. So little pathways like that is an endless number of little pathways like that to go down. Then also this immortality, these stories must be told, the importance of telling these stories, of
Yeah.
playing on the battlefield and then talking about it and
Yeah.
singing about it and hearing about it and
Yeah.
reliving it in court.
And I don't think, like, I make this point with my students. I think there's a danger in looking at ancient texts as, aren't they quaint? They have this poet in a toga, probably, reading stories and, you know, but we keep people alive in the same exact way. I mean,
Yes.
so my dad passed a few years ago, and every year around his birthday, I have, my extended family over, and it's just for dinner. But we invariably tell stories about my dad, and because my dad was my dad, there's lots of stories. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm not sitting there thinking, you know what, I want my dad to achieve Kleos and therefore immortality while he's in Hades. Like, I'm not thinking of that. But we do keep people alive through stories. Stories have that power. Because
Yes.
when my uncle was sharing a story about my dad, and he and my dad playing Monopoly as kids and fighting and all these very specific stories, like, my dad's in the room during
Yes.
those stories. And I think
Yeah.
there's something very human about that. So anyway.
It's deeply human, and it works both ways because the stories we tell are reflections of us. They're
Mm,
collections of our observings. They're collections of the world as we see it.
yeah.
We don't just see objectively and plainly, right? We see through a narrative.
Yeah.
We can't possibly see everything. Every single
Right.
day we're filtering through essentially a kind of story mode. And so when you
Hmm.
talk about your dad and other people talk about your dad, and this is what maybe is sort of nervous about telling stories in front of people, is that you're revealing yourself too. You're
Yeah.
sort of stripping yourself down. And so that's another deeply human, part of
Hmm.
that. So I like that connection, Jay, you're making to drawing students into the story to see this is what we do. Anything we keep alive, we talk about through stories, from
Yeah.
national stories to regional stories of greatness to heroes or great failures or whatever. All of these
Hmm.
things are retold this way. Okay, so
Yeah.
that's what's happening. I think in the scope of the story, the scope of the Odyssey, coming out of the Telemachy, meeting Odysseus, and the reader trying to figure out who Odysseus is. This is a great build chapter too, and so some of the essential, I would contribute the essential parts of this book 8 to the reader's experience of the Odyssey is learning a great deal about Odysseus. And one of the big moments here for me that I picture and I always go over pointedly with students is in this book. Let's see, page 127. I'll get the line for you here. And that is line 90. I don't know if that lines up or not in your book. So ran the tale the minstrel sang. He started, this is the song of Odysseus and Achilles, the first song, and the fight with Agamemnon and the quarrel and all this. And so ran the tale of that the minstrel sang, Demodocus, and Odysseus with massive hand drew his rich mantle down over his brow, cloaking his face with it, to make the Phaeacians miss the secret tears that started to his eyes. How skillfully he dried them when the song came to a pause, and threw back his mantle and spilt his gout of wine. But then the singer starts singing again, and then in his cloak Odysseus wept again. So our great hero, who is going to relive his battlefield glories, and who, like Doug Anderson reminds us, was probably taking a great deal of pleasure in skewering and killing.
Hmm.
Shockingly, I would say out of nowhere for hero stories that I'm familiar with. I'm thinking about these, warrior movies, I grew up with. Rambo,
Hmm.
sort of comes to mind. I just don't really picture Rambo crying. Although I did rewatch First Blood Part 1, and Rambo does cry in that movie.
Yeah.
He breaks down in the ammo store on the floor, so that kind of ruins my story a little bit. But he but to find Odysseus as this person who's crying into his mantle and hiding it for rehearing the story, it's not all glory. It's not all this tale of his
Right.
fantastic win. It's not just Tom Brady, winning the Super Bowl again or whatever. There's that part, that memory part of it that's sad too. I don't know. What do you make of that? Do you kind of linger on that a little? Was that something?
Yeah. I just feel, I've never served, but I feel that It seems that what the best books do is that they defy thematic categorization. In other words, I
Hmm.
wouldn't be comfortable calling this like this is an anti-war poem, which you could
Yeah.
do. Equally, I wouldn't consider the Iliad or the Odyssey war poems. I mean, I wouldn't consider them pro-war poems. They feel to me like war poems. Like this
Mm.
is all of it. You're going to get glorified descriptions of battle and
Yeah.
pretty brutal descriptions of battle where like women get slaughtered and enslaved and
Right.
raped. And then you're
Right.
going to have glorious fighting, and they're going to have a guy falling off a roof because he's drunk and he dies. And like,
Yeah. Right.
so I think like all of human experience, like nothing's really ignored here,
Yeah.
which makes it really hard to say the Odyssey is this.
Hmm.
Like, and I would say that's true of, you know, Hamlet and Pride and Prejudice and Beloved, and like really great books defy that kind of categorization. So
Hmm.
and they also, anytime it seems like something else a book like this does, and you're calling to this, I think, whenever a character is comfortably in one sort of imaginative or emotional space, like confident warrior Odysseus, you're
Yeah.
going to have at some point soon whatever the opposite of that is, because he's a full human being. He's not one thing,
Yes. Yeah.
you
I
know.
like
And
the
Odysseus is the first character, I think, in Western literature that shows us there were all more than one person.
right. Right.
And he's,
However heroic and unrealistic. However, they'll tell you
yeah,
it was a wooden horse, but actually we were sewn into cows. So
I know.
there's this epic part of it that's sort of hiding
Yeah,
the truth. There is, on the other hand, there is this, these details that defy your expectations about these. It's like reading the Bible and finding out that a whole lot of characters in the Bible are really horrible people.
yeah,
You think, oh, they didn't just whitewash, glorify every single
right.
character here. There's
Yeah.
some rotten actors and important people actually too.
Mhm.
So it's a little bit of that. Yes, I go down that path. I hope that's what students connect with, to see this is a real person who, as you say, if he can't cry about thinking about the men who were lost, the
Oh,
experiences he had, then I don't want to read about him anymore. He's not a real
right.
person to me.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a cartoon now. It's not this deep important book that we're supposed to be digging
right.
into. So I like that. So in digging in, essential parts of the book, there's the songs. I like the setup you gave us. There's 3 songs in this hosting circumstance. For me, the first dramatic scene in this is Odysseus pulling his hood down, hiding his face in front of everyone to
Mm.
show to hide his tears, either to hide his identity, or I don't know if it's a bit of, if there's any shame in it. I don't
It
know that.
might be all of that, right? It might
Yeah.
be a combination of, it might be more than one thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then we get to this second part that seems to take up. I mean, that's important in the book is the games. There's sort of a replaying of the Olympic Games
Mhm.
thing here, right? So the Phaeacians are proud of themselves, proud of their skill as boxers and broad jumpers and runners and discus throwers and wrestlers and all of this. And so the next sort of section in the book starts to kick off this sort of competition of games. And in
Mhm.
this, we also see the passion of Odysseus. He
Mhm.
tells them, and it's true, I got better things to think about than playing games right now. Like, I got to
Yeah.
think about getting home. I got these concerns. And so you might think he would just blow off the fact that all these younger guys are going to go out and play it. And when he says, I don't really have time for this, he gets ribbed for it.
Yep.
And one of the characters, Sea Reach, put his words in contentiously. This is line 170. The reason being, I see it, friend. You never learned a sport. You don't have any skill in contests of fighting men. So why don't you just stay sitting over there, sort of hiding your tears, or wearing your cloak if you want. And Odysseus, he's not this sort of noble guy, who just lets a comment like that go and just pats, young Sea Reach, you
Mhm.
don't know what you're talking about, and lets him go. I've killed 100 of you. He doesn't. He says, hey, wait a minute. That was uncalled for, friend. You talk like a fool. And he doesn't take it. He said, you spoke heart wounding words. I'm going to answer you. So he takes it as a challenge.
Yep.
So to building out this character of Odysseus, He's the kind of guy who, when he hears stories that reminds him of times that were of glory but of loss, he cries. When someone puts a challenge to his dignity, his ability, even in something like, I guess we're talking about a foot race or wrestling or something like this, he says, "Hey, don't call me unskilled or unpracticed in this thing. I'm as good as," well, he says he's as good as any of you, except for maybe in foot race, because I've been floating in the ocean for so long. Like it hurts. I don't know. He takes it like a wound. I like it. I don't know. I like it. It doesn't seem petty to me. That he takes that on.
Yep.
And so for me, this is a part of that, of his spiritedness. It's that side of, I've read in Plato, his tripartite soul sort of description of the charioteer driving the chariot, and the charioteer is reason. And then he has these two wild winged steeds that are pulling, in different directions. You're trying to make it to heaven, essentially to the heights, but you have desire pulling one direction. And, this is like lust and appetites of all kinds. And then you've got this, and this is a strong wild steed. And then you've got this other wild steed, which is my favorite part of this description of the psyche, really. It's my favorite psychology, is the spirited horse, Thumos, I think. Yeah. Is that right? Thumos, this Greek word Thumos, that is like spiritedness, that's like fire, that's indignation, that's like belly or gut. That you feel at various times. It's anger as well, I think, and that's another steed that pulls and is this power, and reason is back here trying to drive the chariot right in the right direction. So if you're thinking about that and thinking about Odysseus as a portrayal of this kind of soul, I think this builds him out a little bit, in that regard.
Yeah. And Paul Cantor, who just died, is a professor at UVA. He taught a Shakespeare and politics course.
Yeah.
And he looks at a lot of Shakespearean characters as, their correspondence to either political philosophy or the tripartite soul. So he refers to, Coriolanus as a Thymotic man, and he refers to Hamlet, so at different moments, different parts of who they are seem to rise to the top. And I think he would say similarly about Odysseus. It's a handy structure.
He's great. He's great. I've listened to him only on Shakespeare stuff, really, and I know there's more out there. But it's a good pathway to go down as well, as if you're talking about Odysseus's character and drawing in sort of a Greek presentation of the psyche. Not a bad one at all. To say the least.
It's also it's universal. I mean, those parts are what make up a person. And if the presumption, I just think one of the challenges is that, in Plato has an idyllic sort of balance of the three, with reason sort of taking charge. That's not necessarily the case in works of literature. I think each work of literature has its own ethics and metaphysics that you have to like pay attention to. And but the terminology, I think, is helpful. You know what I mean? Like a good person in this poem isn't the same as a good person in a Shakespeare play, and even a good person in one Shakespeare play is not the same as a good person in another Shakespeare play.
Yes.
So,
no, that's right. They're not like sort of stamped out portrayals of some, canonical account of what the soul's supposed to look like. The artist is playing it out, is working it out. And even, I don't even know that Plato and Homer, are going to agree entirely, on this. Although Plato does seem to lean on Homer for his, for his illustration or his demonstration of what he's talking about. But it's a good route. It's a great way to dig into what's being seen here. So again, sort of panning out what's happening in Book 8 amongst the other plot things that are happening. One of the character things that is happening is that Odysseus is being built out. And so I think landing on this and saying he takes indignation and jumps right in, girds his loins and jumps in with the discus throw and the other competitions to show he's no slouch, even though he might be however old he is, 45, 50. I don't know, how old he is.
Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Right. Maybe he's
70.
Get
his birth certificate.
Yeah. Right.
Probably not. I mean, knowing Odysseus, he probably would have a lot of fake IDs. He probably said exactly
as many as you need.
Yeah.
So,
Do you have
um,
did you share an obvious passage or no?
um, no, not really. I don't think. I think for me, the obvious, most important thing I wanted to point out
Yeah.
was this thing
Oh, okay.
about the spirit, about the
Yeah, yeah,
spiritedness
yeah.
of Odysseus' soul. I think that kind of lands for me.
I have something related to that. So in the Emily Wilson, it's around line 493, 494, and it's
Okay.
his requesting of the bard, Demodocus, his requesting the song about the wooden horse. And
Mm.
he says on 494, so sing the story about the wooden horse. Um, and he says about himself, he hasn't revealed who he is yet. Odysseus dragged it inside into the citadel, filled up with men to sack the town. If you can tell that as it happened, I will say that you are truly blessed with inspiration. And I think this is, I don't know this definitively, but I would imagine it's the only moment in the history of epic literature where an epic hero from one poem requests a song that features himself from another poem, which is kind of meta and funky
That's
and
a very
postmodern
interesting
and
point.
weird. Um, so interestingly, the the Demodocus sings. The Greeks set fire to their camp. Odysseus brought in a gang of men into the heart of Troy inside the horse. Um, and the it says like Ares, Odysseus with Menelaus rushed to find Deiphobus's house, and there he won at last through dreadful violence, thanks to Athena. So the poet sang. A lot is glossed over, like phrases like through dreadful violence. Um, you have to stop and imagine, right, what that looked and smelled and sounded like in real time.
Mm.
So the song ends, and then this is the moment that stands out to me. One of the moments in the entire poem. Odysseus was melting into tears. His cheeks were wet with weeping. And here's the epic simile.
Yeah.
As a woman weeps, as
Yes.
she falls to wrap her arms around her husband, fallen fighting for his home and children, she watches as he gasps and dies. Now that's enough. That's enough information. So
Yeah.
Odysseus is weeping like the wife of a fallen man in war. Fine,
Yeah.
but it's not done. She shrieks, a clear, high wail collapsing upon his corpse. We're still not done. The men are right behind. They hit her shoulders with their spears and lead her to slavery, hard
Yeah.
labor, and a life of pain. Her
Mm.
face is marked with her despair. In that same desperate way, Odysseus was crying. And I mention this passage
Yeah.
because of the depth of the simile. To me, is sort of like when a film score music, the music gets loud as the film's way of saying, pay attention, right? These
Yeah.
really intricate similes, I feel, are Homer's like highlighting this for me. Like, pay
Mm.
attention to this. And
Mm.
it isn't simply a woman in despair. It's a woman who's not only lost her husband, but is going to be beaten and enslaved, which is what happened to all women when they
Yes.
lost. We know that from the Iliad and the Odyssey.
That's right.
So what's interesting about this is Odysseus knows what this sounds like because he's done it to people.
Yeah. Right.
So the way he's crying is this.
Mm.
And that is so he's crying like the enslavement sounds of women he himself has enslaved
Yes.
and done
Yeah.
God knows what to. So
Right.
I just find that to be just an incredibly potent epic simile.
Mm.
One, if not the most powerful in Homer, in the top 10.
And you're right. It goes too far, right? Like
Yeah,
enough has been said at part one,
absolutely.
and then there's part two, and there's part three, or
Yeah.
level three that keeps
Like
going.
losing your loved one, I can imagine wailing on the
Yeah.
battlefield. But then the other
Mm.
side of that is the enemy's lurking.
Yeah.
They're not going to be nice to you,
Yeah. No, it's going to be ugly
you
from
know?
here on out. As best
Yeah.
as you can tell.
I
And,
just
and
read A Thousand Ships by Natalie Haynes, which if you haven't
yeah,
read, she's a
no.
she's a classicist stand-up comedian. So no, honestly, PhD in classics and a stand-up comedian.
Okay.
And A Thousand Ships is the Trojan War from the perspective of the women, and it's
Yeah.
phenomenal. It is phenomenal. And there's a sentence in there that this sort of reminds me of. In war, the men give up their lives. Women give up everything else.
Hmm. Yeah.
Oh, it's such a
That's an
powerful
interesting
sentence.
line. That's an
Yeah, you'd
interesting
like.
line.
Well, check her out on YouTube, and everybody else, listen, find Natalie Haynes. She has a book called Stone Blind, which is about the Medusa story. So she tends to like reinvent these classical stories and make novels out of them, and they're great.
Yeah,
But anyway,
yeah.
I digress. But that's the passage
No.
that blows my mind every time.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe this I had a passage sort of in something you said kind of reminded me of it, that Odysseus is a perpetrator of these things that he then in a way suffers emotionally. He suffers, he cries in the same way as if something as horrifying as this was happening to him. So from his, in his psyche, something parallel has happened to him. The loss, the suffering that he's felt is a loss and a suffering like the one that we can see maybe more clearly, like women driven into slavery, at the point of a spear.
Yep.
He feels something similar to that, and that's surprising. I think one thing that was surprising to me that I like about this perspective, and it's a perspective that reminds me of a perspective you find in Beowulf as well, and other sort of epic-ish story like that is, and this would bring us to the end of the chapter 2, which is that when Nausithous closes out the chapter after this scene you're talking about, I think he knows then that, all right, this is a guy. I don't know if he knows it's Odysseus or not, but he knows, okay,
Yeah,
this is too
real
hand
deal.
in glove.
Yep.
There's something personal here that's happening, and he says here on the last, the last part of the page, okay, come on, out with it. You have to tell us who you are. Who are you? There's just too much drama here. What's going on? He pulls out this little story on the last page of the chapter in my translation. There is, however, something I once heard Nausithous, my father, say. Poseidon holds it against us that our deep ships are sure conveyance for all passengers. My father said someday one of our cutters homeward bound over the cloudy sea would be wrecked by the god on a range of hills thrown around our city. So in this age, he said, let it be or not, as the god pleases. And there's sense about fate and about time and about living the life that fate has put in front of you. Nausithous says, there was this prediction. Is it now? Is it going to be in our time, in our age, that this bad thing everyone has sort of dreaded would happen? Let's say, the end of the world, Armageddon, some kind of, apocalypse. Maybe let it be. Let it bring it on. If that's what it is, so be it. We'll live through it. There's a kind of, and this gets back to that complexity of the soul. There's a reason working in that. There's a spiritedness that maybe fights against it. There's some passion or feeling you have about it, and you're trying to put all that together and drive.
Yeah.
With all of these things pulling in different directions, and that sort of stood out to me. That sort of stood out to me, that the king has that perspective going forward with Odysseus. Maybe you're the guy who's going to set off disaster for us. We're going to be a final offense to the gods or to Poseidon in some way. But if that's it, so be it. I'm here for it. Play on.
No, that's good.
And that's sort of the drama, that the chapter closes out with. That's nice. That's a different perspective.
Yeah,
you want to dig into. And understand in order to understand the character.
Yeah. My surprising passage connects to my question.
Okay.
They're kind of one and the same.
Yeah.
I'm not even going to read you alluded to it. It's the sports business.
Okay.
And it's exactly what you just said. It's the difference between a gladiator and someone fighting in a Roman legion. It's the difference between, a Marine and someone playing football on a Sunday. And if you watch a day of football, it's amazing the military metaphors that are used. It's a real battle today. We're playing at Soldier Field, where on and on and on and on.
Right.
And the gap there is significant. And Jonathan Shea, whose book Odysseus in America I've referenced, said that here in this chapter, Homer shows us that the Phaeacians are landscapes. They're tourists in the landscape of suffering. Tourists in the landscape of suffering. So they themselves have never fought and sacrificed and died and held loved ones as they were dying and seen body parts strewn around and screaming children, like all the things Odysseus saw and felt for a decade. They have no knowledge of it. They have songs, and then they have metaphorical war through sports. But just the
Right.
chasm between those two things is so significant. And I think the reason this chapter includes it, because you don't need it for the Odyssey as a poem to work. But I think
No.
the next chunk of the poem, which is the most famous chunk of the poem, Odysseus telling his backstory to these people, I
Yeah.
think we have to learn about who these people are so that we can imagine the drama of Odysseus's story as he's telling it to them. Because
Okay.
their lives don't bear any resemblance to Odysseus's. So this is science fiction. I mean, this would be as out there as you could imagine. If you just lived
Yeah.
on, a glorified Gilligan's Island and you're just hanging out with the
Yeah.
professor, Marianne, Alcinous, Nausicaa, all of them.
Right.
So if you're just doing that and you have a wonderful idyllic life, and then suddenly this guy shows up and what he's about to tell you is what you hear. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. So I think that that's the
Yeah.
real purpose of showing these people and Odysseus's initial sort of emotional response to his own backstory in front of them, which is risky and interesting. And the poem ends, as you said, and this was my lingering question to my students when
Yeah.
I would read this. I asked them to journal. The chapter ends. The king basically is like, "Can you tell us about yourself?" And it's basically like someone who's been relatively innocent and living without this sort of martial conflict,
Yes.
asking grizzled experience to explain itself.
Hmm.
And I asked my students how they think that's going to go. And it's
Okay.
interesting just getting them to think, oh yeah, so if a war veteran came into this room where no one ever served and we said, tell us about yourself, like what are the next 10 minutes? Like,
Hmm.
what does that feel like?
Hmm.
And what is he going to edit out? And so I think some of the relative innocence of his audience is actually wicked important going forward, because we have to stage not only the stories he's telling us, but the play within the play happening, him telling this group of people, and
Yeah.
we're watching him tell the group of people. I think that's important.
That's fantastic. That's a really great perspective. I've never really thought about that, about these people being tourists in the land of, what was it? Tourists in the land
Tourist
of
in the
suffering?
landscape of suffering.
Tourists
Yeah,
in
the
the
Jonathan
landscape.
Shea books. I don't have a million books on the Iliad and the Odyssey, but man, the
That's
they're great. They're
That's
and
that's fantastic for laying that out, and that might be a way of taking these other things that are strictly unnecessary, like even the sports competition. I wonder if there was a sort of violence in Odysseus's play that
yeah,
they didn't play with before. That might have even been
yeah,
frightening,
yeah,
to them. He did it. He did discus like someone who was taking people's heads off,
right,
through through discus. They threw it like athletes, like guys who are
yeah,
just going to the gym. And
yeah,
so to see that, you're in the presence of something different. But then also to pair that with someone who's crying, who's breaking down, that is showing them, illustrating to them what it's like to be in war, as you say, because
mhm,
they don't know. So here's a supremely violent and capable person who's also,
yeah.
deeply upset by this. All
And
right, that's good.
the 10,000 one, just one quick thing, and I know I'm talking a lot,
No,
but to me, the 10,000 foot looking above this, it's one of those chapters that reminds us that so much of this book is about people's struggles understanding each other. Because
Hmm.
how could someone like us, Paul, who didn't serve, and
Yeah,
and frankly just didn't have Odysseus's life? I mean, Odysseus had a choice to run over his infant son with a farming implement
right.
to avoid going to war. You and I have never had to. I mean, our kids have driven us crazy, but we've never considered. Well, I'll speak for myself, Paul. I've never considered slaughtering them with a
She
farming
sit
implement.
quietly over here. Yeah.
Yeah, but truth be told, I don't really have farming implements handy, so maybe things would have been different. But anyway, like, how could you and I understand someone like I mean, you mentioned Rambo. I
Yeah.
mean, if someone with that backstory comes into our space where we get to think and talk about books and go to soccer games and go grocery shop, like,
Yeah.
so much of great books is people's struggles understanding each other. And this is, to me, is like the apotheosis of that is the Odyssey. Like, how could anyone understand Odysseus? But we keep trying because it's fascinating.
Yes. And somehow weirdly, I don't think it's just me who does this. You translate your own really anodyne by comparison life into sort of his soul and try to understand, what about my battles, the battles I fight, the people who I consider my enemies in the, in the struggle that I'm having. It's not with swords or farm implements, but it still feels like a struggle to me. And how would Odysseus, do it? Because we're always questioning ourselves. Are we pushing back right here? Am I doing it enough? Too much? Am I showing my, being true to myself, or am I just being a jerk? And so that's that battle and that struggle that you're trying to figure out, because you're not only a stranger to other people, but to yourself. You're weird to yourself. You're unknown to yourself, and you're trying to figure out in action, which is where it's all figured out, whether that action is the Trojan War or if it's battling with your headmaster over, more freedom in the classroom or something like this, or your book choices or whatever it is. It's still important. And there are more crucial things, in your relationships and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so I think it's good. For me, I'd like to throw out there, and we can end, and this is the last thing I have to say. I want to know. So one of the stories that's told in this book, so if you dig into this with students or friends, one of the 3 stories that Jay mentioned, that is told here, is there's some detail that's going into one of the Spotify playlist songs. It's about this affair between love and war. And so my lingering question is, why is this story here? So Hephaestus is married to Venus, or Aphrodite, and he catches her having an affair with Ares. And he suspects this is happening, and then he sets a trap, and so there's a story of him setting this trap. So art or technical skill, maybe we'd say technology, Hephaestus sort of represents, is lame, and that's a really interesting perspective. I think we're experiencing that. The greatness, the beauty, the profundity of technology, but there's something about it that doesn't have the power of love. It doesn't have the power of war, and those two things will use it for its own purposes, even.
And ironically, war has always needed Hephaestus. I mean, he built Achilles' shield. He builds the best weapons and stuff, but he himself is lame and doesn't. Anyway.
Yes. No, I don't know. He's not taking it to the battlefield. He can't, he can't implement it, I guess. And I'm not even sure that he wants it for implementation for warfare all the time. But just the imagery then on the other side of love and war falling, having an affair. I mean, this is just a brilliant, that's several journal entries. That is a blast to play with on this. Why do love should be in love with skill, with beauty, with art, with technological development, not with the horrors of wars, as we, you've dug into in this chapter so much. Why does she fall in love with war? And why does war try to bring this element into its ugly deeds? But war always does.
Well, think of what Odysseus just requested. You'd think, I'm on a peaceful island. Sing me a song about some nymph or something. No, he's still in love with war. And people that treat folks with post-traumatic stress say that the cure for post-traumatic stress is war. I mean, that's the thing they're craving. That's the rush they're craving. I think Homer knows that. I think Homer has deep psychological knowledge of people and the brokenness that trauma leads to. And I don't want to psychoanalyze Odysseus, but it doesn't take a deep reading to see that he's been through things.
Yes.
I also think that Hephaestus, Ares, Aphrodite's business is part of the greater tapestry in the poem of a fear of not just female sexuality, but a fear of female disloyalty. The men can be disloyal all you want, but we're really scared about, Penelope being disloyal. And we know that the story that haunts the Odyssey is Clytemnestra Agamemnon.
Yeah.
So this is part of the tapestry of the poem, I think, is the fear of female disloyalty.
Yes. And my mind went there to the Clytemnestra Agamemnon story. That's a piece of it. That's been hit. I don't know. That's been brought up at least 3 times, maybe 4 times by now. And there seems to be a clear direct parallel to the story, because it parallels Odysseus's life. It parallels Telemachus's challenge. It parallels what Penelope is doing and not doing. So there's some really strong lines of connection. There are echoes of that in this story, but maybe it brings in this warfare, and maybe some of this we've said about warfare is sort of the justification or the explanation for the fact of this story being told here at this time. It's not obvious, but there is so much to work with. It's not obvious to me anyway, but there's so much to work with in this with students that's enticing to try to drive into and to put together, and then allow yourself to be opened up to, as you were saying, Jay.
Mhm.
Homer's like, his understanding of human soul, his understanding of human psyche, and we're addicted to war. So many countries are, and we can't get off of it. We just keep doing it. And there's this perverse relationship, between it and our feelings about it. They're not what they ought to be. And there's some expression of it here in this, in this thing. And then the connection of technology, because we live in, I don't know if every age thinks of itself this way. We certainly do. The age of technology, if not technopoly, we seem to be almost getting to. And so to take that in this chapter 2 is exciting. There's a lot to deal with there.
Yeah.
Well, other than that, I have really nothing to say. I have nothing to say at all. Except
I just want to say to our listeners, man, I mean, we just did 50 minutes on a chapter that most classes skip. And the next chapter is the most famous chapter in Homer, probably. So we might need sleeping bags and cocoa and a couple of meals.
Right.
Second breakfast.
I'm gonna do jumping jacks in the middle of the next right now. But we'll see. Anyway. We'll see what we can do with it. So Jay, that was great. Thanks for bringing that poem
again.
Yeah, thanks for your insights here, and look forward to seeing you again. All
right.
right.
Good to see you, Paul.
All righty. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.